Hey, Curtis Stone, the Urban Farmer here. I'm super excited to be part of the Missouri Chestnut Field Day. And I know this is a different thing for you guys doing this online, and I can't join you there physically, but I'm here in the virtual, and I'm going to be giving you guys a special presentation, which is a super consolidated but concise presentation of how I started this new farm endeavor that I've been involved with for the last year. Most people who know me are familiar with my YouTube channel or my book or my farm, Green City Acres. And for 10 years, I've been farming commercially and showing people how they can make a good living and profitable on small acreage and growing particularly high value, quick turnover crops. And the farm that I did this year was totally different, unlike anything I'd done in the past, because it was totally orientated around food security. So this isn't about making money. It's not about selling to restaurants and farmers markets or CSAs or any of that. It's totally how do we grow a lot of calories, a lot of food in a small space and have enough to get us through winter. So in this presentation, I'm going to be showing you a lot of the different types of crops that we grow. We're going to go through the sort of who, what, when, where, why. Then I'm going to show you how we did it. We're going to look at infrastructure, how I prepared the field, how I set up the irrigation, what we did for greenhouses, and then I'm going to wrap it up and show you our entire budget. Totally transparent, show you all the dollars we spent to set this up, and I hope you guys get a ton of value out of it. All right, let's get into it.
Before we get into all of the details of how this farm was started and where we went to from raw ground to where it is now, I want to start with the why. Why did we do this? So I've been farming for 10 years, and commercial farming is nothing new to me, but this was a totally different approach. And I've been very concerned with sort of macroeconomic, cultural, and geopolitical issues for a long time. And it seems like when our government lockdowns and big government mandates came in that were forcing farm closures and things like this, I really started to get concerned about food security. And it was about in mid-February where I started to say, okay, I want to take responsibility beyond myself for what's happening. And I've been growing my own food for a long time, and I would honestly say that my family is very food secure. But I wanted to extend that because I've actually been looking at collapse in society historically for a very long time. It's actually what motivated me to get into farming about 12 years ago when I really started putting things in motion to get to where I am today. And I wanted to set up another farm where we could have a surplus of food for if we run into some kind of food shortage crisis, which I think is very possible. But at the same time, I also felt before kind of getting the initial farm in motion, I felt that it would be a good process to do anyways. So let's hope that I'm wrong. Let's hope that there is no food crisis and all of this turns out okay. I still see a win in doing it. One was, I think, the information putting out publicly like I am here today and I have on my website fromthefield.tv over this year is going to be very valuable for people in any circumstance that want to do something similar. And building a community of like-minded people and sharing my knowledge with them and training them is going to have a lot of intrinsic values going forward. So why we did this? Well, it was because we wanted to prepare for some kind of food collapse, and we wanted to build some skills and have a place that was prepared to be farmed, but also have a good amount of food surplus in it. And this farm will only continue to improve over time. So the why was to prepare for a food collapse and set it up so that we could have something. Now, because this farm was more about food security and calories and also wanting to have food over the winter, because we are in a cold climate up here in Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada. We're in a zone 6B. We wanted to have a crop selection that was very different than what people know me for. I've been growing salad greens and microgreens and high value crops for restaurants and farmers markets and things like this over the years. And so this farm was a completely different approach. This was focusing on storage crops, and the seasonality of the farm was really focused on a fall harvest. We weren't really so concerned about having crops throughout the season. Of course, some exceptions to that, tomatoes being the main one, but our focus was on storage crops. So we're talking about things like potatoes. We had 3 different types. We have Yukons, Russets, Warbas, and Norlands, actually. So 4 varieties. The Norland was the early variety, and Norland and Warbas were early varieties, and then the Russets and Yukons were more storage tomatoes or potatoes. So potatoes, we had a lot of onions, red onions, shallots, some leeks for the winter, and then of course things like carrots, beets, winter squash. I mentioned tomatoes and kale, broccolinis, and cabbage. These were the primary crops we were starting with. Oh, celery was another one as well. We actually even planted some corn for just because we love it, and we also plan on processing it by just skinning off the corn and freezing it for the winter. And so with a lot of those crops, particularly the potatoes and cabbage and onions, those crops can store well. So they can be grown throughout the season, and then they're harvested right around the time I'm recording this, about mid-September. Those are all harvested and placed into storage. We have a large amount of cold storage between the people involved. I have a walk-in cooler at home here. Our friends Lindsay and Blair have one on their farm next door, and we have our host landowner has one as well. So we have lots of storage. And then the other crops were all crops that would stay alive over the winter. So the kale, spinach, actually I didn't mention that earlier, but kale, spinach, celery, carrots, beets, and some winter storage radish. All of those crops can be actually stored in the ground under greenhouses throughout the winter, and we can essentially go and harvest them when we need them. Actually, another one I didn't mention there was broccolinis. So all of those crops can give us sustenance in the winter, and even in minus 20 Celsius here in Canada, we can actually go into greenhouses and harvest and eat those crops throughout the winter. They don't grow during the winter, but they can stay alive and more or less stay in a state of stasis that they can provide us sustenance. So it's more about planting those crops in the summer and up to the fall, and then having them be mature before it gets cold, so they essentially just sit there in the ground and are ready for us to harvest when we need them. When we started, all we had was a piece of orchard land. This farm is an organic farm. We're leasing this, so that was the big thing that happened here, is we could make this happen pretty quickly because we didn't have to go through buying land. This is on a already organic farm, has been so for 20-30 years. I knew the farming couple, known them for about 10 years, and it was really easy to do. Basically said, hey, it looks like you got some unused space over there on your farm. Maybe we could lease that off you and find a mutually beneficial agreement. And so there was a portion of this farming operation, which is actually mostly an orchard. There's some pasture there as well, but there was a dilapidated area of very aged apple trees that were past their prime and needed to come out. And so it was really easy for us to carve up a half acre and get those trees out and go from there. So what we started with was basically a half acre of a few rows of old apple trees, and we had to tear that up and fence that in, and I'll get into more of those details as we go through. Who was involved? Well, this was a group of close friends of mine that all had similar concerns. Basically, it was a party of 5, though there's a couple groups of couples involved. But it was 5 parties that came together. We all put in $5,000 to be the initial seed money, and we haven't spent all of that money yet. We've only spent $14,000. But as I go through this presentation, I'm going to show you that for what you see here, because we haven't actually put up all of our greenhouses, but everything you're seeing here is actually quite a bit less than that. This farm could be set up for somewhere around $7,000, and there'd be ways to even cut costs further from there if you wanted to. But we were a party of 5. We all put in $5,000, and basically came up with an agreement that we all agree to share the work. Some of us have more skills in other places, and it wasn't necessarily about making sure everybody puts in the same amount of hours, just more on a trust agreement that making sure everybody puts in some valuable work to make things happen. The farm is located in Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada, and it's really only about a 10-minute drive from where I live in the downtown. We broke ground on April 2nd, but we started planning this farm about early March when the idea came up. The discussion came up with the landowners, and we officially broke ground on April 2nd. And from here, I'm going to explain step by step what we did from here. The first thing that happened on the farm was the original apple trees were torn out, so the owner was very generous to do that for us. He also brought a disc in with behind a tractor and basically did the initial breaking ground, which was very helpful because when you're coming in with raw ground like this and there's lots of roots, to go in with a rototiller right away can be really tough on the machine. So he came in with a disc and did that work for us. So by the time I came in, I had sort of a plowed field. From there, he was also very generous to come in and do an initial rototill with his tractor. So that saved me doing it with my BCS walk-behind tractor, which would have been very grueling work where the machine would be jumping around and it's very tough on the body. So having him do that initial great breaking of ground was super helpful. So that was step 1. Step 2 was sort of in planning, deciding how I wanted the field to be shaped. And because we have a sort of a long rectangular shape, it made sense to run the beds east to west. Now this field faces the south as far as its long way. And there was many different kind of iterations as I played around with how to lay it out. But because there is sort of there's a little bit of a elevation drop in the field, about halfway through it kind of drops down. So at first I had planned to do 3 blocks of 100-foot beds. And so on this farm, I'm operating at a standard 30-inch bed, as I have done with all of my farming practices for the last 10 years. So it's standard that way. We made our walkways a bit wider at 18 inches. And at first I was going to do 100-foot beds, but it didn't make sense because then these 100-foot beds in the center would have a big elevation drop in them, and we wanted to put a lot of greenhouses up here, so that would have created some challenges with having these greenhouses be sort of a strange shape as the elevation drops. So I decided to break the field up into 50-foot segments, and then that way there's only one block of 50-foot beds that elevation change happens on, and then there's 4 other blocks that are more or less level, and so that made the most sense logistically. So from here, we once I decided how I was going to have the beds laid out, I came in with this freshly rototilled field, and I started to string out and mark where the beds were going to go. And so what I did was basically measured off the south fence, which is on the dividing the neighboring property. So went and measured 3 feet off that fence, and then I squared up blocks from there. So I decided to put 5 50-foot blocks, and they are 40 feet wide. So there's 12 beds in each, and they're 30 inches with 18-inch walkways, and there's 8 feet, an 8-foot gap between each block of beds. So basically went and started to stake out along the fence, 3 feet off the fence, 50 feet, and then I'd put 2 stakes in and then leave 8 feet space, and then 50 feet, 8 feet space, so on and so forth, all the way to the end. And each block from there was squared up, just simply by using the a squared plus b squared equals c squared to get your perfect square. Square that out, and then from there, then I bring in my BCS walk-behind tractor, which has a 30-inch tiller, and now I'm tilling each bed. And what I did was I would till all the way down the entire field, and instead of turning around each 50 feet to do one block at a time, I would basically till, call it bed 12. We count our beds from left to right when we're facing the east on our field. So I basically would start from bed 12 for each block. Block 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We titled block 1 on the eastern side of the field because that's where we come in most of the time. So bed 12 for each block all the way down. Turn around, mark where the next one is, till it back. And the main purpose of this rototilling, it's not the only, but the main purpose of this tilling is to just shape out these beds. So by making sure that I'm maintaining a straight line throughout the whole way, I have to adjust my string lines here and there. That's essentially what I did to shape this field out. Once we had all those beds shaped and prepared, the next biggest task, which was kind of an all hands on deck task, is spreading compost. So we brought in 24 yards of really good compost, paid about $40 a yard, cubic yard. And that was enough to spread around 1.5 inches to 2 inches of compost on each bed. So we only put the compost on the bed. We're not worried about the walkways or anywhere else. We're just concentrating it on the beds. So we got that spread out. A lot of people with a lot of buckets back and forth from the pile. We'd bring the truck. We'd load the truck with buckets from the main pile, drive it up to one of the blocks, and then hand bomb those on the beds and spread it out. And then, of course, spreading it with a rake. Once we had all of that compost spread over the beds, this took a number of days. We watered the field down heavily, and then we covered it in tarps for quite a long period of time, basically until those areas were going to be planted. Then at some point, we put landscape fabric down in between the blocks and around the perimeter. And this is basically just to keep weed pressure low in areas that aren't productive, so that we don't have to worry about wasting time managing weeds in areas where we're not growing crops. So that's been a big part of my strategy in farming for many years, mitigating work in areas that aren't productive. So that's what that strategy is all about there. From here, the rest of the work was further preparing the field with irrigation, which we're going to look at, and getting up our first greenhouse. Now we have, at this point, still have yet to build 3 more of these greenhouses, because the rest of these 3 are just to carry crops into the winter. The first greenhouse was our tomato house for the season, but the next 3 are just to keep things alive over the winter, as I mentioned earlier. There was also a lot of preliminary work done in the nursery. I have a really about 800 square foot nursery greenhouse on my property, and I started all of our initial crops. So all of the onion, tomato, cabbage, winter squash, all these crops that went in and are in the field now were all started in the greenhouse before. The only thing that was direct seeded during the main season was potatoes, and we are right now about to start direct seeding our spinach crop for the winter. Otherwise, everything else was transplanted and started in my nursery at my home greenhouse. Let's talk about irrigation. So the plan with this farm was to more or less do what I have done in the past, but because this farm wasn't urban, I could do a little bit more open-ended style irrigation. And I actually wanted to put a dual system on here just to provide us with flexibility. So we have drip, which is the predominant source of irrigation for most of the growing season, but we also have wobblers, and I'll explain each of these. But wobblers are basically a simple overhead irrigation that's very common for market gardeners. In one of our blocks, there are 4 sprinklers, and they basically just spin around and they slightly overlap. And those 4 sprinklers, which are set, there's 2 rows of them. The first row starts on after bed 3, so between bed 3 and 4. And then there's the first one starts 12.5 feet in. Then there's 25 feet between the next one. The next one is there 12.5 feet from that end. That's one row. And then there's 6 beds in between. So the next one starts 3 beds in, just like the first. And there's 2 wobblers there, and then that can water that entire block. Now, the reason I wanted to do this is that some crops, when planted, like to have overhead irrigation, just in that it's good to get a lot of water on the soil everywhere to encourage germination and early stage root growth. Things like direct seeded carrots, early transplants, so things like cabbage going in, even potatoes, to have overhead water at first really gets that crop established well. And then once there's some foliage on the crop, we can revert to drip irrigation and mitigate our water usage, but also it's a far more efficient use of water as you're just applying it directly to the soil where the crop is growing, opposed to walkways and perimeters and such. But I like this hybrid system. I've seen this in a number of places, particularly in another dry farm that I have experience with in Mesa, Arizona, Steadfast Farm. They've done the same thing. And we're not nearly as hot as they are down there, but we are in a dry, arid, high desert climate up here. And so having a combination of these 2 irrigations just made sense. And the other considering factor there was the drip was the more expensive setup, with all the fittings and pipes and filters and all that. That was probably 80 to 90% of the irrigation cost, and the wobblers cost very little. I think maybe a few $100s to set that entire system up. So it was kind of a scenario of why not? If we get that extra benefit, it's only a few $100, let's just do it. There's 3 components to the irrigation system that I want to describe. There is the main, then there is the drip, and then there's the wobbler systems. So with our main, it comes off the main system on the farm, which is all fed just by sort of municipal agricultural water, which is just a treated water that comes in for all the farms in the neighboring area. It's not a well. Since this isn't really that rural, we're on a municipal water, which is treated, has a little bit of chlorine, but no fluoride. And so that water comes in from the main farm. We put a 1-inch line that's buried underground that's pressurized, and it's holding about 40 psi. That main line comes down runs east and west along our main pathway, which is about 8 feet, and that goes underneath. And then it branches off first at block 1 and 2, and then it skips over, and then it connects blocks 3 and 4, and then goes all the way to the end at block 5. Basically from there we have a manifold that comes up, and so all of that is pressurized. Manifold comes up, and then we have it can split off into 2 zones. So some of these blocks we've actually really only watered with drip. Some of them we just only watered with wobblers because it just made sense. But that's the basis of the system there. As far as the drip system goes, we have a timer at the head of each block. And then we've got one zone that comes out. We have a header line for the drip. So our drip is all 1/2-inch poly. Something a little bit unique that I did with the headers on the drip is I made our header line run down, and each bed had a separate header from there. So instead of cutting in 4 couplings for each drip line on the bed, I used a puncture piece to puncture one hole into the header line with an on and off valve, and then each header for the bed was constructed from there. The main reason I wanted to do this is that if you wanted to take the system apart, it could be done with only uncoupling one piece at the on and off valve. And then that way I can have an on-off on each bed. So if I want to turn off a particular bed or turn on a bed, it makes it easy to do. So that's how we did that. Once those drip lines run to the end, they're just pinched off, and we just put on a piece of 3/4 inch poly to pinch that on the end. Now the setup for the wobblers is very simple. The great thing about these wobblers is they're very flexible. They can take a very wide range of pressure. It can be as low as 15 psi, it could go as high as 100 psi. These are mini wobblers, and I like them. They're fairly inexpensive. And basically what we have is, so there's one header line for these, and it splits off into two. So header line goes down, that's just 1/2 inch poly. And then these cover the entire block with 2 lines, and these can both be run on the same zone if you've got at least 20 psi. 2 wobblers on that one. There's an elbow coupler on the corner. Goes along and goes to the base of each stand. And then there's also an on-off valve on that one. And then there is the second one, which has a T-coupling in there. And there's an on-off valve on there as well. So that way I can turn either of those lines off if I want to just isolate half of the block. Our next order of business, as far as infrastructure is concerned, was getting up our first greenhouse. Now, we built these from scratch. I own a tools company called Modern Grower, which is a US-based company out of California and San Diego there. And we actually do a lot of our R&D for tools and manufacturing up here in Kelowna. And one of our farm members, Warren, is like sort of our chief manufacturing guy in the company, but he's also part of our farm. And so we're quite limited in what we can actually get up here in Canada. I really do love the Farmer's Friend Caterpillar tunnels, but there's, with the US dollar right now and with all the stuff going on in the world, it's difficult and very expensive to get these materials up here, those greenhouses. So we decided to build these from scratch. And these greenhouses are built out of chain link fence top rail for the majority of the bow pieces. And then we used a 1-inch EMT for the ground posts. EMT is electrical conduit. And we had a few other pieces that we had to source out locally. To spend too much time on it, we wouldn't have enough time to cover it in this presentation. But basically we built these from scratch. They're 17.5 feet wide on the bottom. They're about 10.5 feet tall at the peak, and they are 55 feet long with 5 feet between each bow. We wanted to build a greenhouse that was very snow hardy, and so that's why we decided to go with a Gothic arch with a fairly steep angle on the bow so that these shed snow well, so we don't have to go and knock snow off in the winter, and we have enough space to cover 4 beds. So that was our primary purpose for these greenhouses, and we still have yet to put 3 up, but we should be getting that done in the next week or so. But the first one that went up was so that we could have a solid tomato crop going through the season. From here, we were just pretty much planting and further preparing the beds. So I mentioned earlier, in the early establishment of the farm, we laid down compost and then wet the beds and then covered them with tarp. So this completed what's known as a stale seed bedding process. So all the weed seeds that would have been in that soil would have felt the need to germinate. They would feel warmth as the sun shines on the black tarps and there's moisture in the soil. So those seeds would have germinated, and then they basically would have died from lack of light. So with these tarps laying on the ground for, in some cases, 2.5, 3 months as we worked our way down the field, we open these blocks up and they're completely weed free and clean. So before I planted crops into these beds, I would just apply a little bit more fertilizer, about 5 liters of fertilizer per bed. This is just a composted turkey manure. It's a product called Sustain. It is an 8:4:2 NPK ratio. And that just added a little bit more available fertility to the crops and worked just great. So I rake that into the bed and then just rake it in gently to not disturb the bed too much, and then plant from there. So whether I'm direct seeding carrots, which is actually the only crop that we direct seeded in the main part of the season, and then the rest was transplanting. Planting potatoes, we're putting them in 1 row per bed, 1 foot apart. Our tomatoes all went in the ground at 1 foot apart. Some of them were 18 inches, the ones that were going to be an indeterminate variety that were a longer season growing tomato. And our squash, we put in 1 row per bed at 18 inches apart. Now, I would actually suggest doing that wider. We should have done them 3 feet apart, single row, but that's what we did this year. And going forward, we'll just do it 3 feet apart with 1 row per bed. And carrots were direct seeded at 5 rows per bed with the Jang seeder using the roller, the XY24, gear ratio 14 on the front and 9 on the back. And cabbages were 2 rows per bed, 18 inches apart, staggered. Thinking about all the other crops we did, but we could spend a lot of time on that. But that's basically what we did for planting this field. So once all the core infrastructure was built, greenhouse, beds were prepped, things were planted, at this point, all we had to do was maintain the field and harvest things when they were ready. It was actually quite surprising to me how little work a farm that is not commercial is. I calculate that it is about 90%, even perhaps more than 90% less work when you're running a farm just for sustenance and food security than it would be to do a commercial farm. So when you're farming commercially, which has been my experience for the last 10 years, there's work to do every single day. You're replanting and preparing new beds every single week. For us, it was always Mondays and Tuesdays. On Wednesday, Thursday, you're harvesting and cropping things out. On part of Thursday, you're washing, sorting, and bunching and packing. And on Friday, you're finishing packing, you're delivering, you're preparing for tomorrow's farmer's market, you're driving around, delivering to restaurants, so on and so forth. And then Saturday, you got your farmer's market. And then on Monday, Tuesday, you're re-preparing beds, planting, so on and so forth. It's basically that cycle day in and day out. When you're running a farm like this, where it's mostly long season crops that are intended for storage, there's very little work. Once we did the initial work of preparing the field, putting up infrastructure and all that, crops are planted in the ground, they're getting irrigated, all that irrigation is on timers, there's very little work. We have only spent between each 5 parties in our group at most 2 hours a week to manage this field. And what is that management work? It's simple stuff. It's coming in, pulling weeds, stirrup hoeing walkways a little bit, and then just coming in to harvest some of the crops that are a little bit more of a continuous harvest, or things that started in the summer, like tomatoes. We would have one person come in each week and harvest a bunch of tomatoes, and then we would just split them up equally for our parties and just do that. And just, a little bit of things here and there. A battery died on this timer, go and fix that. Or we had a pressure problem on an irrigation on this block, go in and fix that. Really simple maintenance stuff. When you're cutting out all the commercial activity, and the other thing I didn't mention there is all the dealing with customers. That's a massive part of running a farm, is customer service, talking to people on the phone, taking inventory for your restaurant customers. I'm going to have this, I'm going to have that. All these things, when you don't have to do them, it's very little work. Just to conclude everything, I just want to go over our total budget, or at least all of our expenses for this year of this farm. Now, in total, we've spent $15,000, but most of this money is money that will never be spent again. So this is to purchase everything you've seen on the farm, including 3 things you didn't see, which are 3 other greenhouses. We have one of those up now, and within this budget, that also includes the steel for 3 of those other tunnels without the poly. So the greenhouse poly for each of those tunnels costs about $400.
So in order to complete those 3 other tunnels, we're going to add another $1,200 to this. So we'll end up around $16,500. So all this is one-time purchases, except things like seeds, nursery soil, perhaps compost, fertilizer, and some more fertilizer there. So that's a total of $2,900. These are Canadian dollars. Is basically an ongoing expense each year to run this farm. The rest of it is one-time stuff. Irrigation, greenhouse supplies, silage tarps, to purchase those to cover the whole farm cost $1,100. All this irrigation stuff, all this greenhouse stuff. We pay $2,000 a year for that farm lease. We paid $3,000 this year because they did so much work for us to set it up that we wanted to give them an extra $1,000. So for our ongoing expenses to continue running this farm at this site, we would be paying $2,000 a year for the lease and around $2,000 in seed expenses and soil and compost and things like that. Though we probably wouldn't need as much compost in the next year. We brought in 24 yards of really, really nice compost from a company called Black Diamond, and that cost $1,200. We might only need to spend half of that next year. So that's all the money. That's everything we spent on this farm this year. So again, $15,000 is a one-time expense to set up a farm like this. There's ways you could reduce these costs too if you wanted to buy used greenhouses, or you found a cheaper way there. You could save a little bit on irrigation. Say if you did everything with wobblers, you'd save quite a bit there because drip does add up. But yeah, that's basically what you're looking at to set up a half-acre farm like this. Now keep in mind, this is not a commercial farm. If I was commercially farming, I would have at least another $30,000. Perhaps you could probably budget a little bit less to set up post-harvest infrastructure. So packing shed, walk-in coolers, all that kind of stuff. Also, this budget doesn't include a lot of tools that I already had. I already had a BCS walk-behind tractor. I have seeding tools. I have a paper pot transplanter. I have a lot of this stuff. So what we're looking at here is on-the-ground infrastructure to set up everything that you've seen today. Within this half-hour presentation, I hope that I covered enough to give people a sense of what it takes to build a farm up and grow for sustenance. When you remove all the commercial factors, there's very little work. It's mostly in the preparation of the field. Everything else is just basic maintenance stuff. So I hope that I've given people at least an orientation on where they can go, on a bit of a direction on how to do this. Really, what we're talking about is preparing a field, getting in core infrastructure like greenhouses and irrigation, getting your beds prepared for the crops, getting the crops in the ground, maintaining those crops throughout the season, and then harvesting the crops. And then at the end of the year, it's closing the field up, either getting your greenhouses up and getting things ready for winter, or covering blocks that have been harvested with tarps for the winter. That's really all that's involved here. When it comes to storage of those crops, of course, you got to make sure you've got places to store those, either root cellars or walk-in coolers, in order to get some of those crops out of the ground. Let's just talk a little bit briefly what you can keep in the ground over the winter. In our climate, a zone 6B, I can keep celery, spinach, kale, carrots, broccoli or broccolinis, leeks, storage radish. We had black Spanish radish and a red meat radish. I can keep spring onions in greenhouses, and I can keep beets in the greenhouses. So all those crops I just listed are going to sit in our greenhouses all winter long. They're not going to be irrigated. Once we start to get below freezing temperatures at night, crops are no longer irrigated for the rest of the year, until it warms back up. But they can sit in those greenhouses covered and stay alive, and they don't even need to be maintained, because when things are cold, there's no weeds growing. So it's basically just those crops are sitting in greenhouses in a form of stasis, and we come and harvest them when we need.
If you keep your crops dry, particularly with carrots, once we get into mid-October, I no longer water the crops. Keep them dry. And that's really important with root crops like carrots, because if your soil's wet and then it starts to get freezing temperatures, that soil's going to freeze and it's going to be very difficult to harvest those carrots. It's really important to keep the carrots dry. Once they're mature, they stop getting watered, and even if it freezes, we get minus 20 Celsius up here. But if the soil's dry, that means that there can be 2 feet of snow on the ground. I can come into these greenhouses and I can fork out carrots in the middle of winter, and they're beautiful, they're sweet, and they're absolutely perfectly edible. The same goes for all these crops. We have some romaine lettuce planted in here. That probably won't get much further past than late November, but everything else should be able to just stay alive in a form of stasis all winter. As far as leeks, same thing. They can be covered in small tunnels and be harvested throughout the winter. Our onion crops, those all need to be harvested before the snow comes. Our potato all needs to be harvested. Our winter squash all needs to be harvested. Those things can all survive fine in root cellars or cold storage throughout the winter. So that is pretty much it in a nutshell. I mean, I hope I covered as much as I could in this short period of time. This is literally a subject I could expand on for an entire day. But in this half an hour, I hope that I covered everything to give you a broad but somewhat concise vision of how it goes to set this farm up. From here, we'll take questions and further expand on some things that there might be a bit more detail needed to be covered.